It started as a faint whisper in the back of my mind, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. My wife, the woman I vowed to spend my life with, had been acting differently. It wasn't one big, obvious thing, it was the little details that started piling up until they became impossible to ignore. She'd leave the house more often, claiming she needed some time for herself or had errands to run in a nearby town. At first, I didn't question it. Everyone needs their space, and I wanted to respect that. But then her trips became more frequent, and her explanations felt thinner, like they were rehearsed rather than honest. Her phone became an extension of her hand. She guarded it like it held state secrets, always face down on the table, screen brightness turned low, and notifications silenced. I'd catch her smiling at her phone late at night, her thumb hovering over the screen before she'd quickly lock it when she noticed me looking. Those smiles weren't for me anymore. They weren't the smiles she used to give when we'd share an inside joke, or when she'd catch me staring at her across the room. These smiles were different, private, secretive, and filled with an excitement I hadn't seen from her in months. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. I told myself I was being paranoid, insecure even. After all, she was my wife. We had built a life together, shared years of love and laughter. Surely she wouldn't betray that. But as the days passed, the pit in my stomach grew heavier. She started dressing differently for those quick trips out of town, putting on makeup, fixing her hair, wearing outfits she used to reserve for special date nights with me. I couldn't help but notice how she'd glance at the clock when she thought I wasn't watching, her focus somewhere far away even when she was right in front of me. There were other signs too. She stopped being as affectionate, her touches becoming mechanical, her kisses feeling obligatory rather than meaningful. Conversations felt hollow, and her laughter became rare when we were alone. It was as if she was somewhere else entirely, and I was just a placeholder in her life. One evening, while she was in the shower, I noticed her phone buzzing repeatedly on the nightstand. My chest tightened as I stared at the glowing screen, the name of an unknown contact flashing across it. I didn't pick it up, didn't unlock it. I couldn't bring myself to cross that line just yet. But in that moment, I knew something was wrong. That feeling, the whisper in the back of my mind, had turned into a roar. Sleep became difficult. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was truly where she said she'd be. Was she meeting someone else in that nearby town? Was I losing her, or had I already lost her without realizing it? Every scenario played out in my mind, each one worse than the last. It's strange how betrayal can start as a quiet suspicion, something you try to push away, but it slowly grows roots in your mind until it consumes you. I didn't want to believe it, but every instinct in me screamed that I was being lied to. And the worst part, I wasn't sure I was ready for the truth, but whether I was ready or not, I knew I couldn't keep living in the dark. I needed answers, no matter how much they hurt. Curiosity turned into suspicion, and suspicion demanded proof. That's when I made a decision I never thought I'd have to make. I set up a voice recorder on her phone. It felt wrong, invasive, like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But every time I looked at her, every time I saw her glance at her phone with that distant smile, I felt like I was being played for a fool. I needed to know if my gut feeling was right, even if the truth shattered me. The night I set up the recorder, my hands were shaking. She had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower, and I knew it was my chance. I moved quickly, installing the app and setting it up to record everything: calls, messages, even voice notes. It felt dirty, like I was betraying her privacy. But then I reminded myself if there was nothing to hide, there'd be nothing to find. For days, I listened to hours of mundane conversations, calls to her mom, chats with coworkers, silly voice notes to her friends. I started to doubt myself again, wondering if maybe I'd made a terrible mistake. But then late one night, I hit play on a recording and my blood ran cold. It was her voice, soft and intimate, speaking words I'd never heard her say to me. She was talking to someone else, a man, and the way she spoke, it wasn't just friendly banter. She talked about missing him, about how she couldn't wait to see him again. She mentioned the nearby town, the same one she'd been visiting so often. My stomach twisted into knots as I kept listening, each word driving a nail deeper into my chest. She spoke about the little moments they shared, their inside jokes, the way he made her feel alive. I realized then that she wasn't just cheating on me, she was falling for him. Or maybe she already had. I sat there in the dark, my headphones in, the glow of her phone screen lighting up my shaking hands. The next few recordings didn't get any easier to hear. Plans to meet up, careful discussions about avoiding suspicion, laughter shared in whispered tones. I could practically see the scenes playing out in my mind, her meeting him in some quiet corner of a cafe, their stolen glances, the way she probably leaned in close when they spoke. It made me sick to my stomach. I stopped listening after a while. I had enough evidence, more than enough, but the knowledge didn't bring me peace. Instead, it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Every moment we spent together after that felt like a cruel joke. Her smiles, her casual touches, her goodnight kisses, they were all tainted now, stained by the truth I couldn't unhear. I started to notice things I had missed before. The way she'd leave the house in a rush after receiving certain messages, the way she'd suddenly seem distracted after checking her phone. It was all so obvious now, and I hated myself for not seeing it sooner. But hindsight is cruel like that. It shows you every red flag you ignored and makes you question every moment you trusted someone you loved. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, listening to her steady breathing, I felt more alone than ever. She was right there, inches away from me, but she might as well have been 1,000 miles away. I couldn't unhear those recordings, couldn't unsee the picture they painted in my mind. The woman I thought I knew had become a stranger, and the life I thought we had built together felt like a lie. But one thing was clear, I couldn't let this go. I couldn't pretend everything was fine and keep living in this facade. I needed to act, and I needed to do it carefully. If she was going to lie to me, I was going to make sure I caught her in those lies. The next step was already forming in my mind. I would set a trap, and this time there would be no room for doubt. I couldn't confront her outright. If she was lying to my face already, what would stop her from spinning more stories? Instead, I decided to set a trap. She mentioned meeting him at a cafe on the edge of town. It wasn't in the recordings directly, but there were enough hints, mentions of a familiar corner booth, a favorite coffee order, and the day she was planning to see him next. It was subtle, but I caught it. The day before their supposed meeting, I acted completely normal. I asked about her plans casually, pretending to be distracted with work and other responsibilities. She told me she had errands to run and might stop by a boutique she liked in that town. Her voice was light, her tone breezy, like she hadn't been plotting behind my back for weeks. I nodded, smiled, even kissed her on the cheek before bed. But inside I was boiling. The morning of their meeting, I told her I'd be working late. It was the perfect excuse to keep me out of the picture. She seemed almost relieved when I said it, her shoulders loosening, her smile a little too bright. Watching her get ready that morning was one of the hardest things I've ever done. She took her time curling her hair, picking out an outfit that was just a little too polished for a casual day of running errands. She spritzed on perfume, the same one she used to wear on our date nights. It was like watching her prepare for a romantic evening, except I wasn't the one waiting for her on the other side. Once she left, I waited for about 20 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. I parked a few blocks away from the cafe she had mentioned in her conversations. My hands were sweaty against the steering wheel, my stomach churning with nerves and dread. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that she wouldn't show up, that she'd be sitting alone with a coffee, scrolling through her phone. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I spotted her car parked near the cafe. She was already inside by the time I arrived, sitting at a small table by the window. And then he walked in. A man I had never seen before, wearing a casual jacket and jeans, but with an air of confidence that made my blood boil. She lit up when she saw him, her face breaking into a smile so warm and genuine it felt like a dagger straight through my chest. They hugged an intimate, lingering embrace, and then they sat down. I stayed hidden, watching from a distance, every moment etching itself into my memory. They leaned in close, their heads almost touching as they spoke. She laughed at something he said, her hand briefly touching his arm. It was the kind of body language you can't fake, the kind of connection that only comes from shared affection. I took photos. I documented everything. Every smile, every touch, every lingering glance. I needed proof, undeniable proof. so that when I confronted her, there would be no escape, no lies, no twisting the story to make herself the victim. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching them sip their drinks, share quiet conversations, and forget about the world around them. At one point, she excused herself and stepped outside to take a call. I stayed low in my car, my heart racing as she stood just a few feet away, unaware of my presence. I could hear fragments of her conversation, something about needing to leave soon, about how much she hated sneaking around, but how worth it felt to see him. When she went back inside, I felt something inside me snap. The doubt, the uncertainty, it was all gone. I had my answer, I had my proof. But instead of storming into that cafe and confronting them right there, I sat back in my car and let the weight of everything settle over me. There would be a time for confrontation, but not yet. I wasn't going to let my anger take over. I needed to be smart about this. As they eventually said their goodbyes and went their separate ways, I stayed parked for a while longer, staring at the empty table they had shared. The damage was done. There was no going back from this. But at least now I had what I needed. The next step would be the hardest part, yet confronting her with everything I had seen. And when I did, there would be no room left for her lies. I didn't confront them right away. Instead, I documented everything: photos, videos, timestamps. I needed undeniable proof. Every image I captured felt like another crack in the foundation of my marriage, each timestamp like a ticking clock counting down to the inevitable explosion. I sat in my car that night, scrolling through the photos I had taken her smile, the way she leaned in close to him, the way he looked at her like she was the most important person in the room. These weren't fleeting moments, they were fragments of a reality I hadn't been part of. When she came home that evening, she walked through the door with the same casual grace she always had, carrying a shopping bag and humming softly to herself. I sat on the couch, pretending to be engrossed in my phone. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, the scent of her perfume still lingering in the air. My stomach twisted. She asked about my day, her voice light and sweet, as if she hadn't just spent hours in the arms of another man. Every word she spoke felt hollow, every smile rehearsed. I forced myself to stay calm, to play along, but inside I was seething. I kept replaying the scene from the cafe in my mind, over and over like a cruel movie I couldn't pause. I wanted to confront her right there, to throw the photos in her face and demand answers. But I knew she'd deny it. She'd twist the truth, gaslight me, maybe even make me feel guilty for doubting her. No, I needed the confrontation to be controlled, on my terms, with no room for escape. The next evening I sat her down. My voice was calm, almost too calm, as I told her we needed to talk. She looked up at me, her brows knitting together in concern, her lips parting slightly as if she already sensed what was coming. I didn't waste time with questions. I laid the photos in front of her one by one, carefully, deliberately. Each image was a sentence in a story she couldn't rewrite. Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as if she was searching for the right words. At first she tried to deny it. She said it wasn't what it looked like, that I was overthinking things, but the evidence was undeniable. Her voice cracked as she switched tactics, saying it was a mistake, that it hadn't meant anything, that she was confused. Then came the blame, how I had been distant, how I hadn't been paying enough attention to her, how this was somehow my fault. Her words washed over me like cold water, but they couldn't extinguish the fire burning inside me. I stayed silent, letting her dig herself deeper with every excuse, every attempt to shift the blame. When she realized I wasn't reacting, that I wasn't falling for her words, she broke down. Her shoulders shook, her hands covering her face as she sobbed into them. But her tears didn't move me. I had already cried enough for both of us, silent tears in the dark when I was alone, tears shed over the pieces of our broken marriage. Watching her crumble in front of me felt hollow. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the same person I had fallen in love with. Eventually the room fell silent. She stopped crying, her face streaked with mascara and regret. We sat there, facing each other, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to argue about. The damage was done, and there was no coming back from it. That night I slept on the couch. Not because she asked me to, but because I couldn't bear to lie next to her. The silence in the house felt louder than any argument we could have had. Every tick of the clock, every creak of the floorboards, it all felt like a reminder of what we had lost. The confrontation had given me answers, but no closure. I still felt hollow, like a shell of the man I used to be. But one thing was certain: the life we had built together was over, and no amount of tears or apologies could change that. I had the truth, and now I had to decide what to do with it. The days after the confrontation felt like walking through the ruins of something once whole. The air in our home was thick with silence, every glance exchanged between us carrying the weight of everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. She tried to go about her day as if things were normal, but there was no normal left. I could see it in her eyes when she passed me in the hallway, in the way she hesitated before speaking, as if she wasn't sure whether to apologize again or just stay silent. I spent hours replaying our conversation in my head, analyzing every word, every tear, every excuse. Her betrayal wasn't just a single moment, it was a series of choices, each one building on the last until it became something undeniable. I wondered if she ever truly felt guilty while she was with him, or if the guilt only hit her when she realized she'd been caught. I wanted answers, real answers, but I knew deep down they wouldn't change anything. I stopped sleeping in our bedroom. The couch became my refuge, though sleep rarely came. I'd lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through images of her and the other man at that cafe. The smiles they shared, the way her eyes lit up for him, things I hadn't seen in her when she looked at me for months. I felt anger, of course, but it wasn't the explosive kind. It was quiet, cold, and deeply rooted, settling into my chest like a stone I'd carry forever. She tried to bridge the gap between us a few times. She'd sit across from me at the dining table, her voice trembling as she asked if we could talk. But what was there to say? Every apology sounded rehearsed, every promise hollow. She said she'd end things with him, that she'd focus on us, that she'd do whatever it took to fix what she'd broken. But trust isn't something you can glue back together with words. Once it's shattered, the cracks remain, no matter how carefully you try to repair them. One evening, after another silent dinner where we barely spoke, I realized something: I couldn't keep living like this. This wasn't a marriage anymore, it was a prison. I was trapped in a cycle of hurt, anger, and suspicion, and no amount of time would undo what had been done. Staying together would only prolong the inevitable. The next morning, I told her I wanted a divorce. The words came out steady, but my chest felt heavy as I said them. She didn't argue, didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with tears she didn't let fall. Maybe she'd been expecting it, or maybe she was too tired to fight anymore. Either way, the decision was made, and there was no going back. The days that followed were filled with logistics, discussing living arrangements, dividing our belongings, untangling the life we had built together. Every conversation felt sterile and businesslike, two people checking boxes on a list rather than a husband and wife saying goodbye to years of memories. When she finally packed her bags and left, the house felt emptier than I'd ever imagined. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was just quiet. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness, not relief, just an absence of chaos. Healing isn't linear, and I know the scars of this betrayal will stay with me for a long time. But at least now I can breathe. At least now I can start to rebuild not a relationship, but myself. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that sometimes the hardest thing to do is let go. But sometimes it's also the only way to truly move forward.